How about with a microphone? This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday, 2nd of April, 2023. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dale Franks.
I'm Michael Wade.
All right, Michael, we have stuff to talk about this week. And let's see, the first thing I want to talk about, I think, is the Douglas Mackey trial and his conviction and facing up to 10 years in a federal prison for basically conspiring to deny others the right to vote. Let's, in fact, while we're here, let's take a look at this conspiracy, shall we? This is a federal crime that will get you 10 years in federal prison. But he made it worse because he didn't just post this on social media, which, as you can see, is just a little thing that says vote from home, vote for her, post Hillary using presidential election. So basically, for the irretrievably stupid, this is a meme that just says, hey, you can vote by text. But that's not all he did. This evildoer also posted this on Twitter. Avoid the line, vote from home, text Hillary to 59925. So these two memes, basically, which not only he posted, but some other people posted, and apparently he got together and said, hey, this is funny, let's post this as well. Okay, well, they got posted, and now he has been convicted of a federal crime for posting memes. I honestly don't know how this will fly as a conviction.
I'm with you. I understand the law that it was these charges were brought under, interfering with an election. But this is pretty weak sauce. And it seems to be squarely against the First Amendment. I'm not even sure how this got as far as it did. I'm surprised this wasn't tossed out on a pretrial motion. But where was he convicted?
You know what? I don't know. I would have to actually go back and look at a story to see in what federal court he was convicted. I just can't believe that. First of all, I don't even know how you make the reach that because you posted these things on Twitter, it somehow deprives people of their right to vote.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I kind of almost feel like if you listen to this and this was the reason you didn't go to the polls, maybe you shouldn't vote. But
yeah, I mean, I'll flatly say it. If this fools you into texting Hillary to 59926, you're too stupid to vote. It's better for the rest of us if you stay away from the polls.
At the same time, I'm for the laws that prevent election interference. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, had Mr. Mackey showed up at a polling place with a long ash stick, a la Joe
baseball
Don,
bats.
Yeah, a la Joe Don Baker in Walking Tall. All right, okay, then we have a federal case, I think. But
yeah.
Posting a meme on social media, nobody's holding a gun to these people's heads and making them text Hillary.
Well, and it's really hard to see how this can withstand First Amendment scrutiny. I just don't. There's nothing about the First Amendment that inhibits your ability to lie, to say stupid things. Matter of fact, it's
a good thing, or no politician could ever be elected.
Exactly. I just, although it is part and parcel of how the left is, or has been for actually now quite a while, gunning for prohibitions on speech, And all it takes is a little bit of nibbling around the edges before you get a major fissure. And all of a sudden, hate speech is enshrined in the law. And of course, who gets to decide what hate speech is, which is always the issue. Um, quite a bridge too far under current First Amendment uh, precedent. So I'm not really sure what's going to happen here. I'm hoping that the circuit court will have enough sense to just override this completely and dismiss the charges, but we'll see.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what circuit it's in, doesn't it?
It actually really does. I mean, if it's in the Ninth Circuit, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I could see them coming down on the side of free speech, but I could also see them saying, "Hey, this is um, messing with our gal." So, you know, um, I would think that if it was in the Fifth Circuit or the Seventh Circuit, Seventh Circuit, being Chicago being the biggest center of the Seventh Circuit, or even in the 10th down in Florida, I would think that this would get overridden pretty quickly. But I don't know. I mean, it's going to really depend.
Okay, well, I'm just looking at the story right now. A self-styled far-right propagandist, okay, from Florida was convicted Friday of charges that he conspired to deprive individuals of their right to vote in the 2016 presidential election. Douglas Mackey, 33, of West Palm Beach, Florida, was convicted in Brooklyn federal court before Judge Ann M. Donnelly after a one-week trial.
Wow, I wonder how they got that. They pulled that off. There should be a personal jurisdiction issue there as well.
Yeah, how are you hauling a Florida resident to Brooklyn to face federal criminal charges?
Yeah, I mean, I assume that the argument was that he directed his memes towards somebody in New York or in Brooklyn, or somebody from Brooklyn complained or something. I don't know.
Yeah,
But
my understanding is, and of course I'd have to go in and do a little more research on this. My understanding is they didn't actually present anyone who was victimized by this. They didn't present anyone who actually failed to vote for these memes.
that seems problematic as well. I mean, this just seems like a complete farce of a case.
It's a case that
And
never should have been brought. If brought, he never
no,
should have been convicted. And
right,
and of course now we know what circuit we're in,
right,
and if they don't overturn this, then I mean this is. I mean, we've talked for a long time, right, about how free speech is under assault. And of course, the response from the left has always been, well, no, it's not. Nobody's being thrown into jail. You're just getting pushback from other people who are exercising their free speech rights. So there's no cancel culture. This is just the First Amendment the way it's supposed to work. All right, now
right.
we have a guy who posted pictures on the internet, and he's now looking at 10 years in a federal prison. Can we now say that free speech is under assault? Because I can't think of any other way to interpret this, but this is a blatant anti-free speech assault. And by the way, this is not the only person who did that, because as I posted on Twitter earlier this week, there are examples of Democrats who are doing the
Right.
same thing, saying, text your vote for Trump, avoid the long lines at the polls and stuff like that. Any of these people being prosecuted? Well, no, of course not. And so once again, we now see, in addition to the First Amendment problem, we now see the two-tiered justice system problem.
Yeah. And that's becoming increasingly a big problem. I mean, it's just so evident everywhere that the left now doesn't even, they're not even pretending that there isn't a two-tier system. They just say it's okay when we do it. I mean, you don't need to look further than Trump and Biden in the handling of classified documents. Um, I'm
Yeah.
still really unsure how,
Yeah, Biden had classified documents from back when he was a senator.
which he should have never been able to take anywhere, period.
Yeah, how the hell did he get those out of the Capitol building?
yeah. And somehow that's okay because he's just messy. What? Uh, at least when the documents that Trump had in Mar-a-Lago had already been cleared as a SCIF. It had to be because it was one of the places that he reviewed all kinds of information as president. They were guarded by Secret Service detail. They were kept in a locked, caged room at the request of the National Records Archive. So how was that worse? Or and let's just keep it even. How was that different? I mean, if they both have classified documents they're not supposed to have, well,
And in Joe Biden's case, in a cardboard box in his garage.
yeah. And then in several different places. And who knows if we've even found them all? We don't know what's in his library at University of Delaware. Why have a library if you're going to prevent people from actually looking through it? What's the point? So yeah, it's just. But like you said, it's just another indication of this two-tiered justice system.
Look, at this point, if you don't know that pretty much every institution in the federal government has been corrupted, you're a fool. If you don't think that there is a two-tiered justice system in this country where, all through the summer of 2020, demonstrations that turned into riots and people who were arrested, Democrats putting up their bail money, getting them off, eventually no further charges. But, January 6th was an insurrection that nearly overthrew the government of the United States. If you don't see this two-tiered justice system working in this country, again, you're a fool. And if you don't think that the Constitution is under assault, you're a fool. There's no hiding it anymore that these people are incompetent, which, by the way, they are deeply. They're fools, too. But they're fools with a plan. And since they own the press, the academia, basically all of the large-scale institutions, since the left now owns those, well, good luck. Our culture is heading. There was a thing this week that says at this point, since 1990, the number of Americans who feel that religion is important or marriage is important or all of that has just collapsed to a minority of the population. We are watching the country, and I'm 58, almost 59. The country in which I grew up in is gone. It no longer exists. And the country that I live in right now is moving straight towards the USSR. And I know that sounds like hyperbole, and that sounds like, well, you're not accepting enough of the new things and the evolving consensus of increasing freedom and democracy.
Get off my lawn.
Yeah, it's me. It's the old man on the lawn. I built this cruise missile to stop these kids from playing ZZ Top. But the United States of America that I grew up in is gone. And the country that's replacing it is looking increasingly like it's going to be a totalitarian hellhole.
Or it's actually, I would think that it's going to be more like the Balkans. It's just going to be enemies mixed in together who hate each other.
Well, that's the Kurt Schlichter prediction, right?
Yeah.
And Kurt was, as was I, on active duty, whenever the entire Yugoslavia fell apart, and quickly a civil war started. Now, I went off of active duty in the middle of 1993. He actually was still on active duty and actually got deployed to Kosovo during that time and saw firsthand what happens when you have a civil society that tears itself apart, in this case over ethnicity, Serbs, Croats, Orthodox Christians, Muslims. There were all sorts of fracturing, dividing lines on that country, a country that, Joseph Tito held together largely because it was a police state, and B, because he had a spoil system in the internal Yugoslavian political system, so that everybody from all of the Serbians, Croatians, Bosnians, Muslim, well, of course this was communist, so Muslim and Christian didn't matter in that sense, but all these government jobs were sort of doled out on this proportional basis. So he had really two prongs of trying to keep Yugoslavia together. A, the police state, and B, the spoil system that he created. Of course, when he died, and the Warsaw Pact, and he, of course, Yugoslavia wasn't a member of the Warsaw Pact either. I mean, not technically. They were a aligned, independent country. They had this weird...
They were sort of a beneficiary of it in a way.
They were a quasi-communist Switzerland in the middle of the Warsaw Pact, but he had pulled them out formally of the Warsaw Pact, although, he was using Soviet doctrine and weapons and whatnot. Very weird case, but the fact is, when he shuffled off this mortal coil, the whole thing fell apart.
Right, and there was no commonality left amongst the people.
Well, certainly
so
not without
not
without a police state to brutally repress any possible talk of secession.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, but they had no shared culture. They didn't grow into one people. They just became factionalized. So when it fell apart, it was brutal. It was ugly. It was deadly. And it's obviously better today, but it's still not great there. What are the chances for prosperity in that area? Not much.
Well, the weird thing about the United States is that, you can look at Yugoslavia and you can see sort of the ethnic and religious fault lines. And by the way, the ethnic and religious fault lines generally go hand in hand, because these ethnic groups tend to be either monolithically, Eastern Orthodox or monolithically Muslim. But again, these are cultural and ethnic fracture points in their society. What scares me about America is that America is not, despite what those who are pushing DEI would have us to believe, America is not divided along ethnic lines. America is divided along ideological lines.
Ideological and regional. I think.
Which, by the way, often go hand in hand.
Yeah. And I could easily say, city versus everything else as well, which tends to fit very neatly inside those ideological boundaries. So,
and the difference between the United States and other countries, let's take Germany. Look, if you're from Bavaria, okay, you roll your R's in this really super weird way, and the way that you speak German sounds a little comical, but you're clearly German and always have been. You are a German. In the United States, what provided unity for us was certainly not religion, was not some sort of ethnic stuff. I mean, Irish not wanted, Italians need
Italians,
yeah. I mean,
Chinese.
What held America together was an idea, a shared ideological predisposition for the proper role of government, the proper role of individual freedom in the organizing of a society. And
that's the whole concept of America exceptionalism, that the left either doesn't understand or...
I think they understand it very well. They just don't like
I think a lot of them do, and simply misrepresent it as, well, what's so exceptional about America? Well, the idea that we are the first country ever not to be formed based on ethnic
or linguistic affinity.
Fealty. Right. We weren't even formed based on a shared language. I mean, we certainly had one, but that kept changing. We don't have an official language. It's the only country in the world to be based on the idea that the people will rule the government will be limited, and we'll roll from there, and anybody can be an American. You don't have to have some ethnic origin. You can come from anywhere and be an American.
But the trouble with that is that I can't appeal to some atavistic, temperamental attachment that you might have to, blood or kin or soil or
And
whatever. The problem is that we now all have to agree about a certain fundamental principle, or a small set of fundamental principles that determines how America works.
we did for a
And for a long time, yeah, we
very
did.
long time.
Now we clearly do not. So if you have an entire country that was created on the presupposition that certain principles are inviolable, and those principles are now gone, what happens
Well,
to
once
that
the
country?
glory of Rome evaporated and nobody was willing to support it, it falls apart.
And why support it when you have enough gold to pay barbarians to do the job of defending you for you?
That's right. And well, everything had moved east by then anyway.
Well, yeah, it's true.
But it is remarkable that, I mean, we're really that close to just a complete collapse. And it's all through the mismanagement by the elites, our political class, who cares not one whit but for themselves, and just the complete undermining of American culture, which some people deny even exists, that there is no actual American culture. And that's just pure poppycock. I mean, you go to Europe, I mean, I look pretty Irish. I can pass as German just walking around. People know I'm American immediately. Everybody does. Before I even speak, they know. Americans carry ourselves differently. We have a different attitude towards life, towards other people, towards everything. We come across with a certain amount of swagger and confidence. And that's just who we are. We believe in ourselves, and we don't see limitations as anything other than, a barrier to overcome, something to tackle.
Yeah, well, that may be true for Americans of my generation. Increasingly, it looks like that is not true for younger generations. I mean, there's always a bell curve, and there's always some people who will keep these ideals. But in point of fact, it looks like the culture is moving away. And if it does move away from these traditional American assumptions about the nature of individual liberty and the nature of government and its subordination to liberty. And clearly, this conviction of Douglas Mackey is an indication that you can find 12 people in Manhattan, put them on a jury, and they'll give you 10 years in prison for posting a meme. If that's the country we live in now, then I think we are very close.
It's not the same country.
It's not the same country. And at some point, and this is something we've been talking about for years, at some point, somebody in some state or group of states will simply say, nope, this is not the deal we signed up for.
Yeah, no mas.
Peace out.
Well, it is interesting. You bring up younger generations. One of the things I think it gets glossed over too often is that Gen Z, especially later Gen Z kids, who are now, entering into their college years, early 20s, that sort of thing. They're actually more traditional. They tend to favor religion more, favor family more, or more patriotic. It's like we've got this generation.
Yeah, well, don't worry. We have college to kick that out of them.
Yeah, right. Well, the funny thing is, it's almost like that's what the political class wants, is to get to our kids as early as possible, to steer them away. Because let's face it, the people on the left, they're killing their own kids left and right before they're even born, or not even having kids. So they're not contributing to the next part of the world. So they are getting outnumbered just because of the people who, like Kurt Schlichter likes to call us normies, are getting on with their life, having families, raising their kids, teaching them values. And the left doesn't like that. They really don't like that. And it's not just the left, it's the whole political class doesn't like that. They want all these people, everybody, to be subsumed by the political class's values, by all fealty and observance to the federal government at all times, no matter what they say, no matter how contradictory it is to reality or what they said 6 months ago. That's all they want, just absolute obeisance. And they need to get to the kids earlier and earlier in order to affect that.
Well, they're doing a pretty good job of it based on what I can
They
see.
have been.
This whole thing that we're going through or have gone through in Florida with Ron DeSantis and the bill to prevent discussions of like things of a sexual nature.
Well, we went through here in Virginia too with Glenn Youngkin. Not quite as much free for all, but
yeah, but we actually got to look at what the kids are seeing. We got to look
right.
at what they're reading. We got to look at the material that they're being presented.
And that was the detriment to the pandemic. And when the parents started learning what was really being taught in classrooms, that's how this all got started. I was like, wait, what? You're teaching what?
Yeah, well, as that picture of the two boys in that one book doing the oral sex thing, where it was just actually, just drawn in there. You might as well have an illustration just to show you, how. Parents didn't like it.
Huh? Shocker.
But, how long has this been going on? For a long time. And of course, when, like in Florida, although in Virginia, as you said, it managed to go through with a little less hoopla.
It was more based around the election of Glenn Youngkin than any laws. Because in Virginia, we still have a Senate that's a majority Democrat. So not as many laws can get passed and that sort of thing.
Right. But in
Florida is completely Republican. Yes.
Yeah. So, Ron DeSantis pushed all this through and people started learning what is being taught in school, and it doesn't look good for schools. Especially, look, if you were graduating high school classes with 100% literacy rates, kids who knew history and math and English, okay, I might think, well, you're doing a good enough job that we might toss a couple of extra electives your way that you might want to teach. Still want to monitor what it is, but when you are graduating 40% of high school students as functionally illiterate, you have no business getting into anything other than reading, writing, and arithmetic, because that's your core function, and you're not even doing that. All of this other stuff, no matter how nice it might be to have, even if it was stuff I would agree with, I don't want taught if these kids can't read or write when they get out of high school.
Right. Well, it's actually even the military has been dealing with this. These kids go to
there's a military summer camp now to try to get people smart
just
enough
up to speed,
just smart enough to pass the ASVAB.
Right. Which, I mean, how do you come out of high school, much less college, and not be able to do that? I mean.
Yeah, and by the way, for those who don't know, the ASVAB is the test that the military gives you that tries to figure out your vocational aptitudes and what career fields you might serve well in the military. Every recruit takes the ASVAB as step number one in joining the service. If you can't pass the ASVAB, you can't do anything.
You go down as fodder.
Well, no, really, you're if you can't pass the ASVAB, you're literally too dumb to be in the infantry.
You can't even go to the front lines and just become a waste.
Yeah, because you can't be trusted. Because
not that front line.
Yeah, exactly. You have access to weapon systems where
I said east.
Where you can blue on blue your buddies, and that's not good. We don't want that to happen. And so, you have to have some minimal level of intelligence to be able to serve even in a non-technical career field. And by the way, I'm not saying that infantry guys are all dumb grunts. Some of the smartest people I know are in the infantry, and you got to have some fairly smart people in the infantry. Those are the people who you need as your NCOs and your officers to actually ride herd on all these young 18-year-olds who, let's face it, if you're 18-year-old, you're sort of dumb anyway, and you need adult supervision, especially in combat. So, Yeah, this if we can't even get people who can pass the ASVAB, and look, the Army will take you if you have an 86 IQ.
Yeah.
So if you can't
You
even
still
pass,
can't pass the
and if you can't
ASVAB.
pass the ASVAB, then there's nothing we can do for you. And so what they're
Yeah.
having to do is basically take these kids to what is essentially summer camp and
Right.
teach them how to read and write. And by the
So, I mean,
way,
this has been going on for a long
how
time.
can people in the military teach you how to read and write when educators who have 12 years at trying to do this can't, but you can do it in 6 weeks at some sort of quasi boot camp, quasi
Remedial, right? Yeah.
remedial education system in 6 weeks.
But my father, I remember telling me years and years ago, a couple decades ago, about these kids coming out of these elite law schools, couldn't write worth a lick, like just no understanding of grammar, couldn't spell, no idea of like paragraph and sentence structure. I mean, just literally not. Top-notch law firm, one of the top law firms in the country, had to take these kids from elite law schools and teach them how to write. That's ridiculous. I mean, remember didn't you, we did this a few weeks ago, that letter from the uneducated kid from the front of, what was it, the Civil War or the Spanish War?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's
And
always,
he's just like this absolutely just fluent, languid, beautiful prose.
yeah, you got some Civil War infantry private who,
Had no formal education.
didn't go past the 5th grade in the local, town one room schoolhouse with the local
Right.
school marm, and he's writing home to his sweetheart, "My dearest Dolores, a brooding sun glowers over the ruin of yesterday's battlefield." Okay.
As I contemplate my next repast, I have longed for your touch.
And to now, when our messages home from soldiers consist basically of emojis with the capital U and the letter for substituting for an R substituting for actual words.
Finna. Finna is like, I think, one of the most annoying slang terms in the world, because I think it's supposed to be fixin' to. It's a slang contraction of a slang term that doesn't even, like, you're too lazy to put an X in there.
And by the way, who's going to run our supply chains in 20 years?
No shit.
Who's going to program our computers? Who's going to
pump the gas? And I mean, not into the cars, but who's going to get the oil?
Who's going to drill
out of the ground?
The gas?
And who's going to drive it around the country?
We've built this system, and this is the thing that terrifies me. We've built this system that is so reliant on technology and expertise. And we have always assumed that we will have the appropriate number of engineers who can do the appropriate calculations to keep all of this stuff running. And I don't know how these engineers are going to do that when they're being taught that, well, 2 + 2 can in fact equal 5.
Right. Yeah. And, don't think about bridges as straight lines. That's racist. What? Let's think about, what's safest.
Well, I mean,
what about tolerance levels?
Now it's coming off of the liberal arts side of academia, but think of the number of educational articles that are being written on a fairly routine basis about how important it is to deliver math and science from the patriarchal structures that they impose upon the rest of us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you know why those are patriarchal? Because they deal in reality and they tell you what is possible and what is not possible. And
right.
When they say this is simply not possible, the math doesn't work out. Rewriting the math doesn't make it more possible.
No, and there's no better way to do it. I mean, this stuff has been developed over millennia, and there were women that helped do it too. Matter of fact, a lot of the bulk of it to begin with wasn't even done by white people. It was done by, Persians and Egyptians and the Jews. I mean, and the Greeks. Well, I guess Greeks count. I don't know if they do or not. I don't know how it works anymore.
Well, in this country, since about 1940 or so, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Prior to that, they were lumped in with the Italians. Well, what really gets me is if you go back to the 1860s, even the Irish weren't technically considered white.
Oh, yeah.
Even white was pretty much restricted to
WASP.
English. Yeah, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Right.
In fact, there was an entire political party in this country whose sole purpose for existing was to prevent Catholics from being elected to any office anywhere ever.
That's right. And that worked pretty well, too, for a while.
Because, the papists had some sort of conspiracy to subjugate us to Rome, I guess.
Well, I mean, that was why Catholics were hated in a lot of places, just because, your fealty is to the Pope in Rome, not to
John Kennedy.
Your country.
John Kennedy had to answer that question in 1960.
Yeah.
Even in 1960, they were saying, well, what happens if the Pope says one thing and it goes against American policy? What will you do then, papist?
Right. They're clearly not worried about that with Joe Biden.
No. It's difficult to find a Catholic Democrat, anyway, who has more than what I would consider a cultural connection to the Catholic Church.
At best, yeah.
Yes. Nancy Pelosi, always so proud of her Catholicism, and she's shocked that she's been denied communion by her bishop.
She's such an idiot.
Idiocy and arrogance do not go together well for maintaining a society. And by the way, if any part of this technology and engineering heavy society that we have built, if any part of it starts to break down,
right,
the entire thing collapses. The second that we can't figure out what shipments need to go where, cities have 3 days food max in cities.
Well, I was going to say, it's even worse than getting it from one place to the other. How about growing it? How about harvesting it? It has to start somewhere. And if we don't have people to do that, we're going to be dependent on others, except all the others.
Here's the problem. We have outsourced our entire agricultural production to 3% of the country. Basically, ConAgra and Archer Daniels Midland, that is farming in this country.
That's right. That is the vast majority of it. I mean, we still have local farms and things like
sure, they exist.
Well, milk's an interesting one, just because back during FDR's administration, they created little monopoly regions so that while you could easily get milk from California to Virginia without having to worry about spoliation. No. You can only sell within your market, and only certain farms can actually produce the milk. And that's why milk has always cost more than a gallon of gas.
Yeah, and by the way, 1930, 34, 35, that's still the law.
Yeah, that's right. That's just how it works.
Well, the second this thing starts to break down, it goes fast. And by the way, once cities run out of food, how are millions of people going to be fed?
They're not.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that really gets me about all these people who are saying, and I've seen it on Twitter. Now, I'm going to assume that half of them are feds. But, there are all these people on Twitter who apparently are saying, well, it's time to grab a rifle, head to the hills, and start raising an army. Well, okay, but I don't think you realize how bad a civil war, millions of people will probably die if there is a civil war.
Yes, at a minimum.
Largely,
at a minimum,
and largely of starvation.
That will be that. Hell, from tetanus, from a really bad cold or a flu. I
Yeah,
mean,
the inability to get medicines, antibiotics. There's all kinds
right,
of knock-on effects. That's what this those who are talking about it, and again, I'm going to assume half of them are feds trying to
right,
do something. But people who are talking about a civil war, you don't really realize how bad things will get if there is a civil war. This is
yeah,
not 1860. Okay,
right.
90% of Americans don't live on their own farms and grow their own food and make their
Have no
own
idea how to
clothes.
hunt, no idea how to fish,
Yeah, we don't live in
no
that.
idea like how to find analgesics in the woods, um, how to travel long distances by foot or horseback,
Yeah,
how to
we don't
build anything.
we don't know how to do any of those things. People in 1860 did. So you could
Right,
have a civil war where
right,
basically civilians could largely ignore it. Well, until Sherman started burning an entire swathe through Georgia. But prior to that, civilians could largely ignore the Civil War because, hey, they grew their own food, they could grow their own flax, make their own clothes. People were
right.
a lot more self sufficient. Um,
Yeah,
that's not the world we live in. 3% of our people work in agriculture and know how to produce food. The rest of us, like me, I know how to code things and I know how to make websites and I know how to tell if a Windows server is going wonky on me. None of that will be useful in a country today, a modern country that falls into civil war. It would be a disaster of almost unimaginable proportions, and some people are rooting for it.
yeah.
Look, I'm rooting for change, but I'm certainly not rooting for that because, especially at my age, that means that everything I've worked for my entire life will probably be destroyed. It will probably be gone. And I will be facing the last 20 years of my life searching through the rubble for canned goods, I guess.
It's not um, it's not an auspicious outlook. And I have kids, and you know, what are they going to do? I mean, however much longer I have on this mortal coil, they've got a lot longer, hopefully, but not so much. I mean, it's going to be greatly shortened if we absolutely collapse like that.
Somebody this week wrote this tweet says, yeah, things are bad, and the government is turning the justice system against conservatives, and we have this two-tiered justice system, and all these other things are going on. But hey, at least you get to say that you lived during the collapse of an empire. All right. Well, living during the collapse of an empire is not the same as living through the collapse of an empire.
Exactly. Like, who would I say that to? I get to say that? Great. Who am I saying that to?
So and yet
Not exactly the ride I'd ever sign up for.
And yet there are people in this country who could not be doing more to foment a civil war if they were intentionally trying to do it.
Sometimes wonder if they are.
This shooting that happened last week in Nashville, and
Mhm.
did we actually talk about it last Sunday, or I don't now
I don't think we did we?
I don't remember if we did, and we certainly didn't have the amount of information about it now that we have.
Yeah.
But we had this person, Audrey Hale, I guess was his/her name, because we don't really know what gender they were, apparently, according to the New York Times and Washington Post. Went into a church. The church had a school there. Killed 3 children, 3 adults, and then were killed by the police. And by the way, I do want to talk about that police response. But 2 days later, here's Joe Biden on Transgender Recognition Day, talking about how transgender people are the heart and soul of this country. Well,
No, they're not. That's just idiotic.
and yet says it with a straight face. And of course, the entire press response to this shooting has been, well, if it wasn't for the fact that conservatives were so mean, maybe transgenders wouldn't shoot them.
Shouldn't
And
wear those short skirts, conservatives.
yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's the she was asking for it defense.
Yeah.
And by the
That's
way,
exactly what it
at
is.
that transgender protest that they were having in the state capitol, I forget where it was off the top of my head, and they were holding up signs about 7 victims. There weren't 7 victims. There was a perpetrator, and there were 6 victims.
Yeah.
And that sort of fuzzy thinking really irritates me. I just do want to say, um, after having looked at the body cam of the 2 officers that were the ones who actually pulled the trigger on Audrey Hale, um, the entire it took 6.5 from the minute they got there and they started rolling up to the time that they killed her. It was 6.5 minutes. They
Yeah.
cleared that entire thing, heard the gunshots. Their tactical response was great, which, by the way, tells me that the Nashville Police Department spends a hell of a lot of money on emergency response training. They just have to, because these guys all got together. It was a scratch team. It was just whoever showed up. They made up 2 fire teams, and they immediately began going through 2 separate entrances, 2 separate ways, clearing. They both met at the same time once shots were fired. They both ran towards the sound of gunfire, and they eliminated the threat instantly. So as far as their response goes, from the time they arrived, it's difficult to see how those guys could have done a better job, which tells me that they have been trained on this over and over and over, which, by the way, makes me feel pretty good about Nashville PD's emergency response setup.
Yeah, absolutely. They were absolutely relentless. They never stopped. They just kept going. And the team leader was like, okay, go, 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 go. He must have said go like 100 times. And nobody hesitated, nobody questioned, everybody just went.
Yeah, everybody was saying, everybody was verbally yelling out their calls, just as
Yeah.
well, cover right, cover left. And you have your point man, and I thought that was really interesting. Rifles first, blue, you go. Okay, I picked up a patrol rifle, or my patrol rifle, which was an AR-15. I basically volunteered to be point guy. I know that.
Right.
Everybody else knows that. When I show up in the building, they tell me, you have a rifle, you're the point guy, and I take point. And I'm looking ahead. I'm concentrating on where the threat may be. I don't concentrate on what's going behind me, because that's what I have a
Right.
team stacked up behind me. They come up behind me, they tap me on the shoulder, go. Now I know that they're stacked and it's time for me to move. I don't have to look around. I don't have to take my attention off of anything. This is the same stuff that, I trained our EST team in back when I was a military policeman. This has not changed. Well, there's been some stuff around the edges, obviously, that have changed here and there, but this stuff hasn't changed for 30 years. I guess it's been 35 years since I trained EST. And it works. And these guys are proof that when properly trained, it works. Having said that, from the time that that attack began until the time it was over, nearly 18 minutes passed. 18 minutes is a long time when somebody's running around with a gun.
2 guns, 3 guns. Yeah.
4, actually, I think.
She had 2 rifles and a handgun, I think.
I thought she had 2 handguns. She had a pistol.
Or maybe 2. Yeah, I
she
don't
had
know.
an AR. Well, they call it a pistol. It's basically an AR short-barreled rifle. Let's not beat around the bush here. A pistol caliber, apparently a 9mm carbine, and I thought she had 2 handguns. I thought she had 4 guns on her.
She might have.
But in any event, 17 minutes is a long time. And by the way, we are supposed to just, I don't know, cower, let ourselves be shot for 17 minutes, because God forbid you should have a firearm yourself in case something like that, in the awful event that something like that happens, God forbid you should be able to defend yourself.
And I still don't understand why there's such reticence to arming school resource officers, teachers, administrators.
Well, over the last 2 years,
Private
many
schools do
cities,
it all the time.
over the last couple of years, a couple of major cities have just removed school resource officers from schools.
Yeah. And I'm like, how is it? It makes no sense to make a vulnerable target less hard. If you want less violence, fewer attacks, then harden the target. And reportedly, and I don't know how much of this we can believe, but reportedly, this Hale person had looked at a couple other targets, but the security was too great. So she changed it to apparently a school she had gone to before, which would give her some tactical advantage since she would know her way around. But um, I don't understand why we don't harden these targets. We harden banks, we harden federal. Actually, we harden all court buildings. We harden libraries, for crying out sake. I mean, why not? I never understood the reticence to this, other than just like every green complaint about energy, they won't consider nuclear because they only want this solution. They don't want options. They don't want to solve the problem. They just want what they want. And
Whether it works or not.
Right. So it doesn't really matter, what's optimal, what will actually result in a solution that gets you what you want. It's all about, no. You just need to do the way I say you do.
Well, it's like since we're speaking of the transgender thing, these whole transgender shows for kids, which a couple of states are now putting in laws that say, okay, you can't do that. You can't have kids at that. Which, by the way, I wouldn't also want kids at a bikini contest, and I also wouldn't want kids at a Victoria's Secret fashion show. They're just
or at a strip club.
Or at a strip club. I mean, that's fine. So, but because
and when did drag shows have been going on forever?
Oh yeah,
and nobody cared.
Yeah, I believe we were talking privately, and I told you back in 1973, we took a vacation from Houston to Florida to Disney World, which, by the way, we're going to talk about a little bit more later. We took a vacation to Disney World, and while we were on our way to Disney World, we went to New Orleans because we were taking the 10, of course, Interstate 10, and we got to New Orleans, and we took a tour through the Superdome, and then in the evening, we took a tour through now this is 1973, keep in mind, I'm 9 years old, and we took a little walk through the French Quarter, and there were drag shows going on there at the French Quarter. Now, I wasn't allowed inside because I was, again, 9 years old. However, the doors were open. I mean, I could just stand out on the sidewalk and look in, and did, without, I don't think, fully understanding, except at some point I do remember thinking, that's not a woman. And whether I should have seen that at 9 years old and whether my parents should have exposed me to that in that way, I will leave up to the judgment of the audience. However, it's been going on forever. I mean, look, Milton Berle went on national television and would dress in ladies' clothes as part of his
Flip Wilson
comic thing. Yeah, Flip Wilson with Geraldine. This has been going on for a long time. Literally no one cares if you have a drag show. They just don't. The second you bring
Rocky
kids
Horror
into
Picture
it,
Show is one of the most famous movies of all time. RuPaul is a major international star
in transsexual Transylvania.
Yeah.
The only thing that's changed is all of a sudden now we want kids involved in it. I say we. Some people want kids involved in it. I can't think of. I mean, I can think of reasons as to why you want to do that, but none of them that assume good faith on your part.
That's right.
And it's interesting. There was I guess it was the New York Times this week, did a poll about, do you think drag shows should be banned?
I saw that.
And of course, 70% of people basically said, no, they shouldn't be banned. See, you should have your children at drag shows. No. That wasn't the question you asked.
Right.
Ask the question.
And they did that on purpose.
Yeah. Ask the question, do you think children should be allowed into drag shows? Exactly. Especially those that may have sexual content. And I bet you're going to get a different answer on your poll. But this conflation is an intentional conflation of drag shows and, drag shows for kids, which are two entirely separate things. And
well, it's the same thing they do with,
you don't make that conflation by accident.
Right. It's the same thing they do with immigration. Are you against immigration? No, I'm against illegal immigration. There's a huge freaking difference. but they do that all the time. They try to conflate so that they can paint the other side as just bad people, racist, sexist, whatever. It was clearly a push poll designed to paint the other side as totalitarian jerks.
Sure. And by the way, when the immigration thing, you can't go up in front of the podium at the White House and tell us how awful fentanyl is, and then
if you're going to keep letting it in,
and then at the same time implement policies that ensure that it keeps flooding into the country because you're intentionally not stopping it.
Well, then they just do the bait and switch. Well, it's not coming in that way. Oh, yeah, it is.
Yeah, sure it is.
No, when we interdict it, it's coming from the ports. That's the stuff you interdict, you idiots.
Yeah, well, when I look for it here and find it,
right.
that must
Wasn't
mean
made here.
That must mean that this is the only place where it exists.
Right.
Because I happen to find it's what's the old joke about the guy who's under a street lamp on his hands and knees looking for somebody, and somebody walks up and says, "What's happened? What's going on?" The guy says, "Well, I dropped $1." And he said, "Where'd you drop it?" "Well, over there." "Well, why are you looking here?" "Well, because the light's better." Sure, I imagine a lot of things are easier to find in ports when you have everything sequestered in containers lined up at the port. The fact that you're not finding it because you are not patrolling a 3,000-mile border probably indicates to me, or 1,500-mile border, probably indicates to me that you're not looking for it there.
No. And they don't care.
Because the Mexican cartels would never send fentanyl north on the backs of illegal immigrants. I mean,
they would never openly admit that.
That's crazy talk.
But I mean, that's government now. They just gaslight us about everything.
Yeah, and with this attitude that you shouldn't be asking us these questions.
Right. You should just trust us to have your best interests at heart. You don't know what you want.
When they clearly don't. I honestly don't know whose interests the government does have at heart. I used to think that they were just dumb, that they were just fooling themselves, that they were doing the best that they could. And of course, it is government, and you do need to have some place for the bottom third of your high school class to work. So, okay, that's the trade-off we make. But at some point, you can no longer assign to incompetence what is better explained by malevolence.
Yeah, that's right. And it's who, cui bono. Well, it's obviously the donor class, the political class is giving what they want. What does the donor class want? They want cheap workers. They don't care about all the other stuff that comes in with it, about the trafficking or any of that stuff. What they want is cheap labor, and they can get it with illegal immigration.
And by the way, you don't even have to hire illegal immigrants to get it.
No, and that drags down the price of legal.
Yeah, that is the fallacy. Well, nobody's hiring these illegal immigrants. Well, first of all, yes, they are. They're just paying them cash. And second of all, the very fact that that pool of labor exists means that they don't have to pay legal labor what they otherwise would. And by the way, who gets hit worst in terms of labor prices by illegal immigration?
The poor.
It's poor and minority and low-skilled workers.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because they have the most percentage of their income devoted towards just these basic resources.
And they're the ones who pay the price. And by the way, they often don't vote. So they really don't have a value to plug into that calculus because they don't exercise the political power that theoretically they would have simply by voting, because so many people simply, especially lower and minority voters, they just don't vote.
Well, neither do illegal immigrants. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Well, that is not true, because there are now several, at least municipalities all across the country, including, I believe now, New York City, where
New
illegal
York City, I
immigrants,
think Minnesota just passed something like
yeah,
this as well.
illegal immigrants are now allowed to vote.
Hmm.
So the point of being a citizen is what exactly?
Right. I mean, you could flood this country with like a tenth of the population of China and just run everything if you wanted to. It's just
Yeah, it's insane. It's insane. We have a government that's not being run for our benefit. And by the way,
it's disloyal is what it is. I think that that's the thing that grinds my gears so much. It's just so incredibly disloyal. It's treasonous, in my opinion. You're not here for America or Americans. You're here for your own self-aggrandizement, your own power, your own chance to grift. You don't care about this country. You have no morals, period. Just sell the highest bidder.
and by the way, this is not a Democratic Republican thing either.
No, it is absolutely not.
This is a political class thing.
Absolutely.
You know, all you have to do is look at what the Republicans have done for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
I mean, the people who are all for, limited, smaller federal government, they were the people who gave us the Patriot Act.
Yeah.
Whenever Obamacare, which was barely constitutional, and you have to give a big benefit of the doubt to the Chief Justice on its constitutionality. And the Republicans were constantly, well, we'll just overthrow Obamacare. We'll just get rid of it. You got to elect us.
You got to vote us in first.
Got to vote us in. Okay. Now what? Well, it's not as easy as. And so they do nothing. Both politicians off both parties. It really has devolved to nothing more than, how do I get elected? I throw red meat to the rubes and hayseeds.
Right. Well, it's a patrician state, so the donor class, has its agenda, and the political class does what their donors tell them, and they sell it to the rubes and the hayseeds. Even though the rubes and the hayseeds are the ones going to get screwed the most.
And look, as far as I can tell, it's working. But
it's worked for them for quite a while.
But I don't know how long it can keep working. I just don't.
You can only run the charade for so long. And the masks are slipping quickly, boldly. They have managed to work us into such a financial catastrophe.
Oh, we haven't even gotten there yet.
I know. And it's going to spin out of control beyond any ability for them to do a damn thing about it. And it may have already started. I mean, I don't think it's, at least I hope it's not quite there yet, but there are some serious dangerous signs going on, especially with, the bank failures and the proposed solutions, forcing USB to buy out Credit Suisse, and USB is going to get screwed. Its investors are going to get screwed. That is going to spread the contagion further. And then who knows what's going to happen?
Well, when you've got that going on one arm, so we've Silicon Valley Bank, if it didn't cause, at least exposed a fundamental problem in the banking system and the way banking regulation works and how overextended these banks are. I really don't want to crawl down too deep into the monetary policy.
Right.
Well, let's just say that we've had historically low interest rates for well over a decade now. And banks have bought a lot of treasury instruments in the United States, for example, a lot of T-bills, T-notes. And now
Which are the bank's assets.
yeah, which are the bank's
Remember,
assets.
those are bank's assets.
But here's the deal. So let's say, and I know that the actual prices at auction, when the federal government actually auctions off bonds, I know they vary quite a lot. But let's just say, for the sake of whatever, that your bond, if you buy a 30-year treasury, okay? A 30-year treasury has a minimum face value of $10,000. So one 30-year treasury bond is a $10,000 bond. And it pays some interest payment, whatever the interest payment is that people decide they're willing to pay at the auction where the federal government does the initial issue of debt. So they ask all these banks, come in, tell us what interest rate you're willing to pay for a 30-year note. So a bank will come in and say, okay, we'll pay you 5% for a 30-year note. Okay, so they give the Fed their $10,000. The Fed gives them the note. Every year, the Fed pays them 5% of that $10,000. So they get $500 a year for 30 years, at which point the Fed then gives them their $10,000 back. That's how it's supposed to work. So $10,000 face payment of 5%. That's the coupon payment. And they call it that because they used to actually have little coupon books where you would tear off your coupon and you would mail it to the federal government and they would mail you back your check for $500. Anyway, well, it may have been $250 because they may pay you twice a year or maybe 4 times a year, in which case it's
whatever it was.
It was. But you tore out the coupon. But anyway, that 5% is called the coupon payment. Okay, well, now I'm holding this and I decide I want to sell this treasury. If interest rates have fallen, that treasury still pays 5% of its face value. That means nobody, if interest rates are paying 2%, nobody's going to pay me $10,000 for that. I mean, I'm sure they would love to, but they're not going to, because I'm not going to sell it for that, because I know that the current yield is 2%. So I've got to raise the price of that bond to, let's say, $12,000. And I'll sell you this bond for $12,000. You'll still get your $500 a year, but your interest payment of that 5% coupon payment is actually equal to 2% yield. And so the banks have been, for the last decade, buying all of these treasuries, face value $10,000, and they're buying them for what, $15,000, $20,000. Well, between 15.
Yeah, they buy them for 10, 15.
Between 15 and 18, generally, because interest rates have been so low. Okay, well, now interest rates are going higher. Now, in one sense, it doesn't affect you at all because you're still getting your coupon payment on these treasuries, whatever that coupon payment is supposed to be. But if I need cash, I have to sell those treasuries to get that cash back into my system if depositors start asking their money back. So I got to sell these treasuries. Well, I may have bought them for $16,000, but I ain't selling them for that. Not if interest rates have gone from 2 back to 5%. The most that I'm going to get is $10,000 off that treasury bond, which means if I paid $16,000 for it, every bond that I sell, I'm selling at a $6,000 loss. That's $6,000 that have now just disappeared because that asset, which I was holding on my books as a $16,000 asset, I'm now selling for $10,000. I have to write off $6,000 for that bond. And so...
This is exactly what happened to SVB.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened to SVB. That's exactly what happened. They had a run on the bank. They have to sell these treasuries, but they're selling them all at a loss. And so they're not getting, so to be able to get the cash to meet the demand of depositor withdrawals, they just took a huge bath on these. And by the way,
lost nearly 40%, a little over 40% of their asset value on these bonds.
Yeah. So, if you bought them for $16,000 and you got to sell them for $10,000, that's a huge, huge loss on that bond. So, we've got that going on.
And then you're still not liquid.
And by the way, this doesn't just happen here in the United States. Just the treasury bond happens to be the most common way that banks sort of do that here. But by the way, don't think that Deutsche Bank does anything different in Germany with the bonds that it buys. And don't think that interest rates are vastly different in Germany than they are here in the United States.
International banking system.
Yeah, interest rates in the international banking system have been at historic lows for 13 years, 14 years.
Right.
And everybody who has bought treasury and or who's bought bonds basically as assets in these past 14 years are now upside down on those bonds.
Yep.
So they face the same level of risk, or at least some level of risk. Now, Deutsche Bank has higher reserves than most banks carry. So Deutsche Bank has much more of its reserves on hand. So maybe that insulates it to some degree from what happens with other banks. But in general, this sort of thing is now facing all of the banking system. Now, let's make it even more complex. Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, India have entered into a trade pact to conduct international trade in their own currencies.
And Brazil I think it was Brazil and China just did a big one.
Yeah. Now, that means that unlike what has happened since the end of the Second World War, where all of these deals for international settlements, they were all made in dollars. So all of these countries have had
or at least dollar-backed assets.
Or dollar-backed assets, but essentially dollars. So all of these countries have to have basically dollars on tap to be able to do international settlements. And that has and so when we talk about the dollar being the world's reserve currency, what we're talking about basically is that everybody uses the dollar because all international trade is denominated in dollars. Oil is denominated in dollars per barrel, for example. Now, what that means is that there are trillions of dollars worth of goods and assets that are sitting out there, all denominated in dollars, that are being traded back and forth between every country in the world. If all of a sudden China, India...
The key word being sitting.
Yeah, sitting. The key word being sitting, because you have to have them in order to conduct international trade. If all of a sudden people decide they're not going to use the US dollar anymore for international trade, they're not going to hold those dollars in those foreign countries.
You mean they're not going to just take them out to the trash and burn them?
No. What they're going to do is trot over to their local Forex window, and they're going to trade the dollar for their own currency. And so those dollars all start streaming back into the United States. A United States that already has 30 trillion in government dollars extra just floating around in the economy. When all of those dollars, if all of those dollars go back, if we're looking at the end of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, then all of those dollars are coming back to the United States.
And then every household has the same problem that SVB did.
Yeah.
Because now our dollar is worth maybe half, or actually, if that many dollars come out, it's going to be worth like at best, 2 or 3% of what.
Exactly.
What it was.
Exactly. We're talking about hyperinflation.
Right.
Because there'll be far too many dollars to go after the amount of goods that would be required to maintain our current living standards. So, it takes me back to that old Dan Aykroyd thing from Saturday Night Live. Inflation is our friend. Wouldn't you like to smoke a $300 cigar and wear $500 suits? I know I would.
Well, now you can.
And yeah, now we can.
Would you like to live in $1 million house?
And by the way, I wrote about this in 2009, back whenever we were doing the Q&O blog. I laid all of this out, how this works and what was going to happen. And as far as I can tell, we're on the verge of it happening. And the trouble, as I've often said with monetary policy disasters, is that everything works perfectly right up until it doesn't. And then everything collapses.
You can only put so many Band-Aids and salves on it to muddle through and hope for a better time to come along when, the economy is going to be hitting on all cylinders everywhere.
And by the way, the Chinese know this. They're not making these deals to do international trade with these countries in local currencies, renminbi for the Chinese, reals for the Soviet, or for the
it doesn't
Saudis.
matter.
It doesn't matter. It's not dollars. And
that's the big thing. Yeah.
And China knows that if they can do that, then it crushes the US dollar. We're going to have to devalue our own currency.
Yes. Well, it's going to get devalued either way.
Yeah. So I mean, this is the beginning of the end of the dollar as a reserve currency. And by the way, why wouldn't it be? Because we've already proven that we are not trustworthy enough to be fiscally responsible to maintain the dollar as the world's reserve currency. I refer you again to the $30 trillion in federal debt.
Right, quantitative easing, um, the constant budgets from Congress. Well, not that we've had a real budget, but the constant spending from Congress, um, the spending by the Treasury alone, which has its own spending ability, uh, not to mention just the Fed printing dollars left and right and just pumping it right into the economy.
Yeah, and
I
by
mean,
the way, the legislature and the president, they're fully complicit in this. All we have
they've
to
been
do is
on top because
look
to
at the
them it's a
COVID
free
relief.
loan.
Look at the COVID relief bills. Look at
Yeah,
the bailouts for the banks. Look at. I mean, it's just
and the
trillions of
thing is that
dollars that
people
we don't
don't
have.
get that all this is when they say, oh, we're going to spend X dollars and we're going to raise it this way. You're not raising it that way. You might raise a piece of it that way, but you're just going to print the dollars, give the federal government a loan. Yeah, it's going to cause inflation. So the money that you're taking out of the Fed is, maybe 10% more expensive than it should be. They don't care. Free. It's free money for them to go spend on wherever they want.
And by the way, we
And
are
it doesn't come
lucky.
out of, they don't have to raise taxes. Inflation is going to happen. That's the tax on everybody.
And by the way, we are lucky that of that $30 trillion, 8 trillion of it is held by the
Held
Fed.
in the Fed.
So
Which, I mean, thank God.
thank God, because if that 8 trillion was released out into the wild, um, that would just be an instant. I mean, the Fed is basically pulling, and the Fed's balance sheet has risen from back in the old days of quantitative easing. They were usually running about 4.5 trillion. They've doubled that now. They're at now $8.5 trillion of treasuries that they're holding in their portfolio.
We have not seen the kind of spending that we're seeing and income versus what's going out since World War II.
And in World War II, we only did it for 4 years.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're at and beyond what we were doing in World War II. And we have nothing like the productivity that we had in World
No,
War
and
II.
we keep doing it.
Yep. Hey, that kangaroo's still far away.
But again, thank God the Fed has 8.5 trillion of those dollars sequestered in the Fed's own holdings. It's not out in the economy. It's not being used to buy stuff. It's just being held by the Fed. I guess we can be happy with that, because if we had because the Fed holds it, that means it's not public debt, right? And so we can play this little dance
Right.
that, well, it's only 20 trillion ish in public debt. Yeah, but that's only because the Fed has decided to hold on to it. It becomes
And
public
that's
debt.
literally the only reason.
Yeah, it becomes public debt. The Fed says we can't hold $8.5 trillion of bonds on our balance sheet anymore.
And we've still never come up with a solution as to what happens.
Yeah, again, what happens if the Fed just says, "Hey, I mean, I, what was it? I pardon you." What's his name in Schindler's List? The Nazi camp commander. I pardon you. If the Fed just looks at those 8.5 trillion and says, "Okay, I pardon you," and just says, "Okay, those bonds don't exist anymore," what does that mean? Does that mean that debt no longer exists? Does it? We don't. We are. People don't realize that we are so far into uncharted territory here.
Yeah.
And they don't realize, again, as I mentioned earlier, we have a system that is very delicately balanced. This is one of the elements of that very delicately balanced system. And if that system goes tits up, and it looks like the Chinese are trying to make it do so, and the U.S. loses its reserve currency status, all that money comes flooding back into here, then, well, on the plus side, I'll be able to pay off the rest of my mortgage on this place for the cost of a really nice hat. But it's, whether I'm going to be able to afford, eggs or
Anything
pork
else.
chops. Because a trip to the grocery store might cost me as much as the remaining mortgage on my house. So sure, that gets me off the hook for my mortgage, paid off. I own this place 100%. And I guess I could sell this place for, I don't know, what, 70, 80 million, probably at that point. I mean,
Bolivars, US dollars, same
yeah,
thing.
yeah. It's just ridiculous, and we've been heading towards it, and it never has happened. And that's the problem, again, with monetary policy. Well, it hasn't happened yet. Everything looks like it's just fine. And the problem is that everything looks like it's just fine until it doesn't look that way. And then when it doesn't look that way, there's no possible way that you can stop it. You're going to have to live with horrific consequences. And so,
Meanwhile, the people who have caused all this have their DACAs and boats and, and other amenities hidden well away and safety beyond, while the rest of us will just suffer.
yeah, but for those of us who were alive in 1971 or 1978 through 1982, and who can remember 30-year mortgage rates of 21%,
Yeah.
well, we might look back on those as the good
It's like
old
good
days.
days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, because that would be a minor hiccup compared to. Oh, and by the way, the only way to alleviate that is to pull that money back into the government. It's for the Fed to be able just to, which essentially means,
Suck it back up, right?
yeah, they have to raise interest rates to such exorbitantly high levels.
Which,
Because,
I mean, the level they have to raise to would just,
yeah, back in 1981, the Fed funds rate, which normally has been hovering at near zero or between 0 and 2% for the last 14 years, try 12% or 14%.
yeah.
And every interest rate in this country is based on the Fed funds rate, which means
That's the bank overnight, overnight bank rate.
technically the discount rate is the bank overnight rate, and that's the one that the Fed directly controls.
Right.
But again, the discount rate in 1981 was 12.5% too.
Yeah.
So basically, those are the rates that every other interest rate is based on. You charge basically the Fed funds rate plus whatever interest rate premium it is,
Right,
depending
because
on
that's
the
what the
risk or
bank, it
whatever.
costs the bank to get the money.
Right. So
And then
your mortgage is basically the Fed funds rate plus
plus.
3% or so.
Right.
Right, mortgages are pretty much deemed to be safe, so they're safe in giving you a lower premium, and that's why credit cards are the Fed funds rate plus 18% because they don't know that you're
Right.
going to pay their credit card back, and they can't really do anything other than call up a collection agency and say that you've been a bad boy, and that's the extent of their legal action that they can take against you. Obviously, they can report it to your credit and trash your credit, but I mean, you already had the
That doesn't
money.
get them paid.
Yeah, you had the credit card. You bought your new car off a credit card, so there you go. You got your car. It's just not looking good with this, and we're clearly not doing anything to stop it. We're just gonna keep gamboling through the fields until it all's down around our heads. I was
Well, and what's
really
more
hoping
worrisome,
this would happen when I was 30, not when I was 60.
what makes it worse is that not just the self-infliction, but now the active undermining that's coming from basically from China and Russia, to accelerate this process. I mean, we have handcuffed ourselves. We put the noose around our neck, and now China's going to go and kick the box out from our feet. Um, it, it's it was so absolutely avoidable, except for the temptation for the near-term goodies of votes and voting yourself the largesse of the company of the country.
It was avoidable, and we've taken very great pains to resist the temptation.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, one last thing before we go, because we are already an hour and 24 minutes into this. So a brief discussion about Florida and the former Reedy Creek Improvement District, which is now,
Right.
I guess, South Central Florida Tourism Board. So the basically Disney-owned Reedy Creek District got together with the Disney Corporation and basically gave them complete control over zoning, construction, everything inside the Reedy Creek District. And they did so by invoking the Royals Clause to say that this can't be changed for the lifetime plus 21 years of any descendant of King Charles III.
The last to survive descendant
the
of
last,
King Charles
the
III.
last surviving descendant of King Charles III. So technically, it's not a perpetuity, but it's certainly well over a century now. And of course, they're saying, well, this means that this new tourism board can't do a damn thing. We now have full control. We are a self-governing entity in Florida. And if we say that we want to build a 25-story or 80-story high-rise hotel in the middle of Florida, the only thing that the tourism board can do is issue the building permit, because we get to decide what density is. We get to decide what gets built, where it gets built. And
remember, it's a tax district too. So that's what Reedy Creek District is basically a tax district. So it can set the tax rates, it can do everything.
And so now this new thing that was created by
they've literally handed the keys to the kingdom.
Yeah, they've literally handed Disney the keys to the Magic Kingdom. And Disney can now legally, according to this document, do anything that they want. I suspect there are legal infirmities to this agreement.
Yeah. Now, I'll preface this by saying I haven't actually read the documents. I've only read some quotes from the documents. And the rule against perpetuities is, it can be difficult to understand unless you break it down to its most simplest concept, which is that land shouldn't be tied up in one family forever. That each subsequent owner should have the right to alienate. So that there's also a thing called fee tail, which is essentially well described by the last descendant of Charles III, the last surviving descendant of Charles III, having ownership of land that descendant isn't even born yet. So we don't know who it is. So it's a fee tail. These were pretty much all abolished 300 years ago. The rule against perpetuities has been abolished, but not entirely. So you can do what's called, say, like a life estate. So let's say husband and wife, husband dies, they own Blackacre, and the husband wants to leave Blackacre to his children, but he wants to have his wife have a fee, essentially an interest in the property until she dies. So that's what we call a life estate. So until she dies, she can live there for as long as she wants. She can do whatever she wants with the property, except alienate it. So you can do that. That's fine. But here's the limit. You can designate a life and being. That means at the time the document's drawn up, there's a living person who you name, a person, not, some potential people. You can name one person who is alive now. And that life plus 21 years is the longest you can draw out that estate. This thing saying that I don't know who read the rules against perpetuities here and thought it was something that was in their favor. But this is just the complete this is exactly what you don't do in order to not run afoul of the rule against perpetuities. So what they've done instead is not named a person, but several potential people who are never known, are not living now, and instead designated Charles III And here's another infirmity I thought about after we talked, is that he's actually not Charles III yet. He's not been coronated.
Well,
So there's even a question that he's Charles III.
technically, legally, he is Charles III. The coronation, he is king. The coronation confirms that.
But he's not crowned Charles III. He's Charles. He may be king, but he's not necessarily Charles III. And they didn't name him as anything else other than Charles III. But anyway, that's nitpicky. That's something I would do to the lawyers.
All right. Well, look, here's the thing. I'm going to assume that Disney's attorneys and whatever attorneys worked for Reedy Creek on apparently Disney's behalf, they know that this is not going to fly. That ultimately,
we would have to think so.
That ultimately they know the courts are going to turn this down. So, and there's this guy on YouTube that he's one of these lefties, and this whole video is Reedy Creek, Disney just gave it to DeSantis, and they humiliated him. You know, the same kind of clickbait stuff, right? That again, red meat.
Destroyed.
Yeah, destroyed with facts and logic. The thing is, I think they know as well as anybody else that this is not going to stand. And so they don't intend for it to stand. What they do intend to do is to invoke a legal battle that they can take to whatever the local Florida district court is, and they can appeal it to the appeals court, and then they can take it to the Florida Supreme Court, and then if they have to, see if there's some sort of federal issue that they can bring it up in front of the Supreme Court, each of which is going to take about 18 months. So just getting it to the Florida, at least. So just getting it to the Florida Supreme Court, let's say 2 years. Okay, so just getting it to the Florida Supreme Court, 2 years trial, 2 years for the appeals
about 6
court,
years. Yeah.
2 years for the Florida Supreme Court. So we're now at 6 years. We basically have 6 years where, I mean, unless the state of Florida can get some sort of injunction against it.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Pending, you know, what the final disposition is. They're thinking this gives us 6 years. And if we can get it to the Supreme Court, 7. So between 6 and 7 years, we can keep this thing wrapped up in legal battles. And by the way, Disney can afford all the legal battle that you can shake a stick at. Well,
not if they keep running Marvel and
not if they keep running Marvel and Star Wars the way that they're running them, but lawyers in the vast scheme of things, lawyers don't cost as much as a movie, right? So,
and I really take issue with that.
So, you know, when you have one movie that makes $1.6 billion, that can pay for lawyers for quite a while, probably 6 years. So Disney probably knows that ultimately they probably won't win on this, but they can push it down the road 5 or 6 years. And by the way, pushing it down the road 5 or 6 years means 3 elections at the legislative level and at least 1 gubernatorial election.
Right, at least 1, if not 2, depending on what DeSantis does.
I think the tactic is the story of the old man who the king was going to have killed, and he said, I can teach your horse to sing. And the king says, okay, well, I'll give you 1 year to teach the horse to sing. And the people come back and say, you're not going to be able to teach. Why have you done this? And he says, well, it's a year. Anything can happen in a year. I could die. The king could die. The horse could learn to sing.
Maybe the horse could sing.
And this is, I think, the Disney strategy. Anything can happen in 6 years. I mean, 6 years from now, Democrats may just overturn this law and we go back to Reedy Creek, and then we can renegotiate, with Reedy Creek.
Friendly.
Yeah, with somebody, friendlier, somebody whose board members we appoint, not whose board members are appointed by the governor of Florida. So
exactly.
This to me just seems like a delaying tactic. I can't believe that they have lawyers who are not competent enough to know that ultimately they'll lose. And so I don't think they're planning on victory in the courts. I think they're planning on victory outside the courts. Or worst case scenario, put it off for 6 years.
I happen to think you're right. And we talked about this the other day. That makes the most sense to me. that this is just, shoving the can down the road in order to give some time for the circumstances to change in Disney's favor, which that could happen as early as this summer if Ron DeSantis decides to jump into the race. I mean, who knows then what happens?
It could be a brand new governor.
Right. So, and then, the amount of money and time that Florida would have to waste on this. I mean, there may come a point where it's like, well, maybe it's just not worth it.
But for now, it gives them everything they want, and they can work on the basis of this as if it were legal until they're told otherwise.
Well, it's de facto legal until properly challenged and overturned. They certainly have the right to file the covenants. They certainly had the right to, make the proclamations and do whatever else the board did. They may not have had proper legal authority to cede, sort of a separation of powers sort of thing. They may not have had the power to do that.
Yeah, these are traditionally governmental powers. Now, again, I don't live in Florida, so I don't know anything about Florida law really, but it seems to me that just there are certain powers that you cannot, as a government entity, give up to a private entity.
Right.
Those are specifically government powers.
Maybe that'll be an issue. But they clearly tried to create as many issues as possible, I guess, to keep this going for as long as possible. Even if they ultimately lose on every single one of them. Like you said, maybe the king dies, maybe I die, maybe the horse learns to sing. So,
and that looks to be like what they're banking on. So
I agree.
We'll be following that, although I expect it'll take a couple of years before we know anything definitive about how it's finally going to turn out.
Yeah.
In any event, Michael, that's our time. We got to go. So have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.
You too. Good seeing y'all.
All right. Well, that is it for us this week. As always, it's a pleasure bringing the podcast to you. We hope you'll be with us again next week. Actually, next week and the week after next are a little bit up in the air. I'll tell you what, I will stream something next week, even if Michael can't make it. Maybe I can get Bruce to agree to come on. I don't know. We'll try to work something out. Anyway, that's all for this week. Have a great week. We'll see you next time. So long.